Morning everybody, Jonathan Scott of the Big Cat People here talking to you from home here in Nairobi in Kenya. Angie behind the camera. And just look at this magnificent picture of Angie's. It won her the overall award in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year in 2002. And the reason, apart from the fact that I love looking at it, that I have it here right now is because it is an example of a perfectly exposed picture. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by exposure? Well, the exposure is the amount of light that you have allowed to come into the camera, or the camera has done it if you're on program mode, to give you a correctly exposed picture. Not too dark, not too light. You can see some details in the shadow areas here, and you haven't blown the highlights. So just perfection. But how do you do it? How does the camera do it? Well, the camera, as we know, Canon, we're Canon Ambassadors, very proud of that fact. This, a Canon camera with a 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens, perfect for safari or travel. And in fact, Canon have recently brought out a new 100 to 500 millimeter lens, zoom lens like this. So again, travel, safari, just the lens you want. But within the lens is something that we call the aperture. It's a diaphragm that can open and close. And then you've got a shutter. And the shutter opens and closes at a particular speed. We call it the shutter speed. So it can open and close very quickly or very slowly. And then inside and at the back of the camera is the camera's sensor. In the old days, it would have been the film. Now you have a digital sensor which is very sensitive to light, and you can adjust how sensitive to light it is by what we call the ISO. So you've got three elements to exposure. And just to recap, so exposure, that is the setting you set which determines how much light comes onto the camera's sensor to give you, hopefully, a beautifully exposed picture. And it's made up of aperture. That's the whole of the lens that you allow the light to come through, and you can adjust it to make it big or small. You've got the speed. That's the shutter opening and closing, quickly or slowly. And then you've got the sensor itself, which you can adjust the sensitivity by the ISO setting. So let's just think about it. Three elements. So, the first, the aperture. Now, as I said, within your lens is a diaphragm, and it can be what we call wide open. And we would describe that, being wide open, as having a wide or large f-stop. So we'd call it in this instance f4. f4. So maximum opening to let as much light in as the lens is capable of doing. But you could close the aperture down to make for a smaller hole, so you could let less light come through. And we would call that f11. So now the numbers have got larger as the hole has got smaller, and f-stop, aperture. So you might say, well, so what? Does it make a difference if you let the light through a small hole or a big hole? And remember, the combinations of how the light comes through to the sensor is dependent upon this. If this is the amount of light you need, you can let this light come through to the sensor by having a small hole and letting the light come through for a long period of time. You could set a slow shutter speed. So you've got a small hole, you know how much light you want to come through, and you're going to let it come through for a 30th of a second to give you this much light, and you'd get a correctly exposed picture. But you could instead choose to have a big hole and then let the light come through for a very short period of time. Let's say 1,000th of a second. And so this amount of light, the amount of light you want to get this correctly exposed picture, can happen through a small hole and the light coming through for a long period of time, or a big hole and the light coming through for a short period of time. And you might say, well, great, thanks for the exercise, so what? Well, the difference is that if you select a large hole, so if you go for this in terms of your setting, you will get what we call a shallow depth of field. What do we mean by that? A shallow depth of field means that, as in this picture that I took many, many years ago of this leopard, as she popped her head over Fig Tree Ridge, you can see perfectly exposed on the leopard, but the background is beautifully out of focus. So you do that by selecting a large aperture. You want to get that large aperture. In this instance, on that particular lens I showed you, f4. You're what we call wide open. And if you were to want to get Angie's picture, where you've got depth of field from where the reflections are to the grey heron, to the elephants, and back into the distance a bit, you need to close the aperture down to a smaller hole. Because according to the physics, the smaller hole will give you a greater depth of field. So you will get more in front and behind your subject in focus. But you might say, well, hang on a minute. What are you really talking about? Because when you look through your camera and you focus on your leopard, when you focus on the leopard, surely nothing's going to change when you actually press the button and you get your picture back. But this is the key. When you look through your camera, certainly with these cameras, you're always shooting with the aperture, the lens wide open. And when you press the button, according to what you or your camera has set for the aperture setting, when you press the button, it might go from wide open and close right down. In which case you will see in your picture more in focus behind the subject and in front of it than you saw at the time when you made your focus. Hope I haven't confused you with that. Now, a couple of things just about your shutter speed setting, because you can actually be very creative with your shutter speed. Now, if you want everything pin sharp, so a Martial Eagle in flight, every feather just perfection, then you take it 1,000th of a second. But if you wanted to get creative, and as Angie did one time with a beautiful shot of a zebra running, she took it at a 30th of a second, maybe even a little bit slower, and she panned. So she used her camera, looking through the viewfinder, and then just tracked the movement of the zebra, taking a series of pictures but at a slow speed, and then you get this wonderful sense of movement and motion. And so you can start playing with your shutter speed once you start knowing what you're doing, and really up your skills in terms of becoming a photographer. Now, the third element, as I say, about getting the correct exposure, and as it gets later in the day and it becomes darker, you might find that you're shooting, depending on how big the lens can open. Now, let's say it's 6 o'clock and your lens is as wide open as it can be. You can't do anything to get more light in. And secondly, you're letting the light come through to give you the required exposure, and you're finding that you're down to a 15th of a second, very slow. Now, if your subject's moving, you're going to get a blurred picture. If it's not, and you put the camera on a tripod, you could still get a sharp picture. But if it moves, you're out of business. But you're not. Because, just let me find my little thing, your digital sensor can be adjusted to allow it to become more sensitive to light. And as I say, some of these Canon cameras, you could go from the minimum setting, which is 100 ISO, through to 50,000, 100,000 ISO, which means you're increasing the sensitivity of the camera so as you can actually start to move your settings back to how you'd want them. So you wouldn't necessarily have to be wide open. You wouldn't necessarily have to be setting a speed of 1/30th of a second. You could go back to 500th of a second, f8, and get a beautifully exposed picture like that. Animals are moving, you still get sharp shot. So you can do this by changing, but the only downside of this is that as you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, it gets noisy. Now with film, we used to talk about graininess. If you shot high ISO or high ASA film, let's say 1000 ISO, it would be like looking through newsprint with a magnifying glass. It would get very grainy. The image would start to break up. And it's the same with your camera with the digital sensor. If you start to push the ISO up, setting up too fast to try and get yourself more light, you will find that the image gets degraded. It becomes what we call in digital parlance noisy, grainy. And so then the image doesn't look so good. And we've got a picture we can show you here of lions and cubs in the early morning, having to take, bump the ISO right up because they were moving. We still wanted to get the shot. And it's very noisy and really not very sharp and nice and crisp the way you would want it. Now I say that, the image can get pretty grainy, pretty noisy, but actually Canon have created such incredible facilities now with ISO settings that you can go to 10,000 ISO, 20,000 ISO and still get beautiful looking images. I mean, there have been times, I know we were with Angie and some of our Maasai friends, and Angie was taking pictures inside a boma, inside the homestead, inside one of the houses with one of the Maasai, and could still get incredible pictures, sharp, nicely lit, for the exposure, the kind of effects that you wanted. And secondly, there are also software programs which allow you to actually work on noise reduction so as to ensure that you still get the best look to your image. Quite remarkable. So you've got those three elements. Now, the fact is, if you're just starting out in photography and you've got a camera which has little settings on the command dial, such as where it says portrait. So you'll find on some cameras, as I say, starting out, there'll be a little icon of a person's head and it'll be portrait mode. If you set that, the camera will do what you could do if you knew more, and I hope now you'll know a little bit more, which basically it will look for shallow depth of field. You want the background out of focus, and that means it will set a wide aperture. It'll open up the aperture of the camera to blur the background, to concentrate on the portrait element of the picture. So this is nice and sharp, all the background's out of focus, and it's perfect. And you can get the camera, some cameras, startup cameras, you just select the person icon, the portrait icon, and it'll do that. Similarly, if you wanted to get the maximum depth of field, then you'd look on your camera and you'll find a little jaggedy mountain and it will say landscape mode. And what the camera will then do, you won't have to do it, it will then close the aperture down to give you greater depth of field, so as your foreground, the grassy fields with poppies in it, the mountain in the background, everything is pin sharp. So that's all about exposure. Now next time we're going to talk to you about selecting manual settings on your camera, whether you want to shoot shutter priority or aperture priority, and how you go about getting this exposure if in fact you wanted to under or overexpose against what the camera was telling you. You want to start taking things into your own hands. It gets a bit exciting, but scary. Anyway, that'll be on the menu next time. Take care and enjoy your photography. Bye-bye.